In tonight's episode, we're going to be checking out several user-submitted stories from people just like you. These are people's terrifying accounts with the unknown, the supernatural, and the mysterious. In 1996, James was only 17 years old, living in southern Missouri at the time. And when a friend of his had asked if he had wanted to see a haunted house, of course James's answer was yes. So James and two other of his friends all piled in the car and headed out of town. Now, after about 20 or so minutes, they turned off the main road onto a dirt road that had kind of appeared as if nobody had been down it in years. After about a half a mile, they came to this small little bridge that went over a small creek. And this is when things all went wrong. James's car immediately dies and they could not get it to start again. So they climb out and start walking down the road towards what his friend said was the property with the house on it. And after about 10 minutes of walking on the road, came to an end and opened up into what looked like a yard with a small iron fence around it. And there in the middle of the yard, up on a smaller hill, was this huge 2-story rundown house. They had hopped over the fence. It was relatively small, so it wasn't too hard to hop over, and began walking up the path towards the house. The house had a rather large semicircular window above the door, which you could see there was a winding staircase just inside. As they get a little closer, one of James's friends said, Did you see that? And the rest of them kind of look confused and say, no, what, see what? Then James and friends all look up and see this light that had came and illuminated the entire stairway. And just then, they all see what looked like this old woman coming down the stairs a few steps at a time, looking at them and turning back and going up the stairs. And then the light goes out. Now, at this point, James and all of his friends freak out. They turn and start running down the path back towards where they left the car. But in the weeds that were about chest high at this point, they had heard something running beside them. So James looks over to his left, and there was a set of red eyes keeping pace with them. They jump over the fence and run as fast as they could back to the car. And as they approached it, they noticed that it had been turned around and was now facing away back to the main road. As they got closer, those eyes that were in the weeds following them, that were keeping pace with them, were now under the car. They're all incredibly frightened, so they jump in the car, noticing that there were no other tire tracks, no footprints, but theirs. No visible or possible way it could have somehow got turned around. It didn't make any sense. James's friend turns the key, and wouldn't you know it, it starts right up. They hit the gas pedal as one of James's friend in the back seat let out a scream, telling him, go, 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 it's right behind us. And they drive in silence all the way back to town. As they pull into James's driveway and get out, the guy that was sitting in his back seat, the one who had screamed go, 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 was now complaining that his back had hurt. So he pulls up his shirt and notices that he had 3 long scratch marks down his back. So at this point, they slowly walk to the back of the car, and there on the trunk were 3 scratch marks in the paint. A couple of weeks after, the guy who had gotten scratched called up James and said, man, I don't know what it was that we saw, but I've been seeing these red eyes outside my window now for a week. I'm freaking out now. I don't know what they are, but I know they're coming for me. And the next day, James's friend sadly took his own life. James is now 43 years old and has never been back to that place and has no desire to return there. He has no explanation for what he had encountered in that house or what the energy surrounding the house was, but that it was peculiar and different than any other house he's been around. He's not sure if it was necessarily haunted, but believes that there was an evil surrounding that place, potentially an evil guardian. I'll let you guys be the judge. BELAMY has 2 very interesting stories. His first involves a large black mass of what he believes was a Bigfoot. So when he was younger, there was a place he and his family called United Narrows. It was around Idaho, Utah, or Wyoming. This was right around between 1990 to 1998, somewhere in that time frame. It is a lake, a river area, heavily wooded, with some clearings for campsites, if BELAMY is recalling correctly. The reason he remembers this encounter so clearly is because, well, there's nothing else that it could have been. And the fact that nothing else was that big that he has ever seen before in that area, and to his knowledge was not inhabited by bears. So Long story short, Bellamy was with his cousin playing with the cup phone and other kids that do that at that age, and they found this really nice bush and were using it kind of like a fort. It was a semi-secluded area, still close enough to run back to camp, but away from adults, which made it perfect for kids to play. And when all at once, they all see this big black mass, no sound, no smell. Maybe they were just too focused on such to hear or smell anything, but it scared them, and they ran. Being little kids, they were convinced it was Bigfoot. Now again, Bellamy reiterates that the shape of this was all wrong, and there's no way this could have been a bear because it just did not seem right. And of course, you could look at this and say, well, they were kids. They could have easily misidentified a bear, especially with the circumstances of them being overly paranoid and scared. It's very possible, but I'll take Bellamy's word on this one. Now, his second story, Bellamy at this time was in his teens, and a friend of his and a few cousins were going to camp in a barn out at Bellamy's grandparents' ranch, because why not? So when they get there, everything was fine and normal. They went in for dinner, and returning from dinner, the moon was either full or very close to it. So they stepped in the barn, and they see this white beak with white and black peppered feathers and white claws and black feet on a perch with white rings around where the eye should be. It looked very intimidating, as Bellamy would describe, for what they thought was an owl. Only this owl, or whatever was posing as it, was huge. Think a jackfruit if it was 2 sizes bigger, and it didn't give them time to get a further look at it. Bellamy barely noticed such before it saw them, and whatever this thing was let out a screech that rattled their bones and down to the very core of the soul. Like there are no words at the time to describe how deep this feeling was into the core of Bellamy's heart, or that is what it felt like. And for the amount of time it was screeching, all the survival senses shot off. Now, you tell me, logically thinking, could this have been an owl? Sure, but you start really taking into account the way Bellamy is describing this, that doesn't really sound like an owl to me. And every warning bell, every hair rose, even the warning mechanisms that Bellamy wasn't aware that he had were just firing on all cylinders. So him and his friends, they ran like madmen, sprinting away. The parents came out and asked what is going on, and more importantly, they heard the noise too. They were asking what made that sound. Even the grandparents were wondering. The animals that were there were acting the same way. Now, if we just stop here and we take all these details of what was just spoken into consideration, there is no way that a barn owl would be able to reproduce this sort of fear and curiosity in not just adults and grandparents, but even animals. Animals are very smart and they react to certain things in a certain way. And had this just been a barn owl, personally, I don't feel like they would have gotten the same results. And in this moment, this thing cries again and flies off into the night. Now, Bellamy swears this was no owl, that it was far too big to be one and it was far too fast. It took everyone a while to calm down, and Bellamy's family and friends do not talk about that night like ever. Bellamy swears he has never seen anything like it since. Now that Bellamy is older and has had some sounds come around, he can give some more information on it. But he went to say that there is nothing that made him feel like that, just maybe the Lord of Rings Nazgul scream, and take that feeling that it invokes, the feeling that Bellamy would summarize would make the deep, dark depression and terror of staring into the abyss, and it looks back, as a feeling of utmost euphoria compared to this. It was the worst feeling that Bellamy ever had. There's no other feeling that is worse than this. Is it possible that Bellamy had encountered a Thunderbird? This third story comes from a guy by the name of Richard. This occurred near Grand Valley, Pennsylvania summer camp. Richard had been going to this beautiful camp for so long that the years just flew by. And time again, Richard would have the time of his life, and thinking back of having some of the very best and most memorable experiences that he'd ever had. This place is stunning and special, and the forest and the cabins and the stars, everything is just beautiful and in abundance. Richard described it as if glitter was falling from the actual sky. Now, all these years later, he had never had one experience that ever seemed as strange. Up there, Richard always seemed to have a complete sense of peace, and never even so much as a chill. Well, that all changed one year. Richard believes it was right around 2002, maybe a year or two shy, but you get the idea. And as always, Richard would be ready to go to camp 3 to 4 days early, mainly to prep camp and clean up and get his cabin ready for the campers. Richard's crew always went up just to settle in and get things ready to roll when the kids arrive. Usually 8 to 10 counselors and anywhere up to 100 plus kids. So all goes very smoothly the first night there, and the next day the same thing. But then, the second day, Richard goes to hit the bed as always, either reading, watching a DVD, or just falling asleep like a brick due to all the exhausting activities outdoors. Apparently the last, because Richard didn't even hit the pillow, and his eyelids were out. He was sacked out. Around 2 in the morning, the cabin, which is very large, which is raised about 3 to 4 feet, sleeps about 13 people, begins to violently shake. And it wakes Richard up very suddenly, and he began to hear a very rough scratching directly next to his bunk. So he pounds on the wall thinking, just an animal. And it stopped when Richard had pounded the wall. So he turned and proceeded to fall back asleep. How? I have no idea, because nope, it started again. And so Richard, annoyed now, pounds again, and it stops. He breathes a sigh of relief, and boom, banging started again. And when Richard says banging, he means banging. And now he's not a person of fear, so he pounds back. Unfortunately, he proceeded to lay on an onslaught of curses into the echoing empty cabin, and it finally stops. Angry, now very angry, Richard's sitting there exhausted, waiting a little while, and guess somehow he had passed out again. And all of a sudden, the pounding and scratching wakes him up again, and it stops again. 5 times total it happened in the night, and Richard responded with these same reactions every time. He was younger back then and just didn't let it bother him. Now, if that were today, he would have gone outside and checked. So the following morning, he wakes up to start the fire pit and get coffee going and relax next to the fire, and then he realized, oh, last night. So he sets his cup of coffee down, goes over to the side of the cabin, and proceeds to look for proof of an animal or somebody that was there. Well, to Richard's surprise, not a scratch, scuff, or disturbed dirt anywhere around the cabin. He walks around the entirety of the cabin and even checks under it and the rest of it. Nothing. Not even a beaver chew mark on the wood. Richard is completely beside himself. But he did his best to let it leave his mind and didn't have an incident the rest of the 11 days there. It only made a light bulb go off many years later that something was definitely amiss. First off, all the windows are open to see in except the curtain window by the trail, so nobody can see in walking past. And second, Richard's floor starts at 4 feet off the ground, and bunk added another 2 feet. The bottom bunk, of course. Third, the bangs were next to his bunk only and not around any other. So what was tall enough to see in the other windows to know that Richard was there and not the top bunk? Also, Richard's weekly supplies for the week fell off onto him. That's also how hard this thing was banging. All in all, it was one of the most strange things to have happened to him in the woods with nobody else around. He still has no answers to what it was and probably won't ever, but is glad that it turned out okay and that nothing bad ever happened to anybody. Richard ensured that there was no drinking or drugs going on at the camp. About 7 or so years ago, Jake had discovered a strange site northeast Alberta, rural boreal forest, while hunting. There was a dead large cow. Her yellow plastic ear tag intact, but below the neck and full cape of its hide, rest of the body was missing. Obviously dead for at least 24 hours, but no maggots, no bugs, no creepy crawlies at all. No scavenging birds or weasels, mice, etc. And of course, no flies. This was September, so things should have still been relatively warm. On the head, only its eyes, both of them, were missing. Nearby was remains, and Jake means only few remains of the 2 cats. This was only apparent that their legs detached and staked neatly between 2 small trees. Of course, there was a blood-soaked ground, some hair, some gristle, but there was a strange aroma in the air, and Jake will describe it as best he can. It was this unidentified solvent. That's the best words for this. Not strong, but it was in the air for sure. The place this happened was on the corner of a forested gravel road, in the ditch, but it's a very busy area with an above-ground oil pumping station less than maybe 1 mile away. Maybe 5 rural cabins or homes within 2 square miles of this ditch. Now, trying to explain this away, it does take a considerable amount of time to butcher 3 cows along this comparatively busy section of rural road. Just north of this spot is a very popular fishing lake with old, disused campgrounds too. Many RVers use it throughout the year, fishermen and hunters too. So it's really hard to believe that they had the time to cut and butcher these 3 cows without being discovered and reported to the police. It's very strange. Jake has never seen scavenging bears or wolves or coyotes or ravens or vultures at all. Once or twice crows, and that's it though. These are commonly seen in northern Alberta, especially if around free dead beef carcasses. So Jake reports it to the police, complete with the ear tag number, and turns out that the cops had informed Jake that these cattle were actually stolen from a ranch elsewhere. And while it remains a mystery of who stole these cattle and butchered them, we will never know for sure. Wes's story is rather interesting, convincing himself that draconians or reptilians or lizards are simply not real. So he goes back on YouTube and looked up other stories about them, and to prove to himself that these beings couldn't really exist, after watching some of them, he still was not convinced they're real and just laughed at himself for even thinking of such a sentiment. But he had an experience that he had went through his past history of life trying to remember if he had met anybody that would pass off for a draconian, but nothing came to mind. Later on, not sure if it was that day or the next, a foggy memory had popped up into Wes's head about 2 kids that it felt like more of a dream he had, so it was pretty realistic. He thought maybe he had dreamed it. After about a week, the memory kept going into more details, so he decided he would do one thing to put it to rest. Get confirmation from Wes's sister. So he calls his sister up, and they chat about a couple of things, just, having casual small talk, and then he had asked her if she remembered meeting these 2 kids with cat eyes. She immediately tells Wes that she did. She even knew their names because they had the same bus stop and rode the same school bus with her. Then, Wes goes into his full version of what he could remember about them and explained how he thought it was a dream. She was quiet for a moment and begins to ask Wes why she too never ever thought about them before. She even told Wes and says all the same things too, about why not ever telling anybody before, and that she stops and then tells her story of what she knew about them, which only triggered more repressed memories from Wes. Now, she said that she went over to their house once. The mother was really strange and acted like she was upset that her kids had brought her into the house. She didn't stay much longer after that, and when leaving, the father had come home and he seemed normal and easygoing, was friendly enough as he said hi, walking from his car to the house. That was the last time she went there and her last memory of them. Wes had remembered her story now after she was done talking, and he remembered that night in him and his sister's bedroom. When she had told him what happened, that's when he had told her to never ever be alone with any of them again, that they were dangerous, and it seemed like Wes couldn't express this to her enough, to just stay away from them. Wes even told her that he would stop loving her now if she was even thinking about playing with those kids again, so it would hurt less if they were to kill her. Wes even remembers the feeling he had when telling her this. As Wes looked at her, thinking it was a lost cause, she was younger and more dumb, but hopefully she'll hear him. She did listen when Wes was this serious. They talked some more about it and agreed to contact each other if they thought and if anything new was remembered. Well, a couple of days later, thinking of nothing else but dwelling on this whole new revelation of memory, another memory popped up. This one was a little more scary than the first. Wes remembers one night laying on the top bunk with his sister sleeping on the bottom bunk when everybody else was passed out. There was a man doing something to Wes's sister, but Wes's sister wasn't making any noise, and Wes wanted to yell for help but could not speak or move. Wes was frozen scared. Wes knows he was feeling really mad too and wanted to hurt this person so much. How dare him do something to his little sister? And he was gearing up for an attack, and then very quickly, near his head, he was talking to him in a low voice, and there was another person's dark silhouette at the door looking down the hallway. And Wes recalls thinking to himself how strong and proud he was that they didn't have the power over him, as he was telling him what to remember and what to forget. The person at the door was the kid's mother, and she kept interrupting him, saying that Wes wouldn't listen, that it's not taking. The man had walked over to her, the kid's father, and he could hear their hushed voices arguing. Now the father had approached him again, all while Wes could only watch. His body would not move out of fear or something else. He doesn't know, but he felt it trembling. And he tells Wes in his ear that he never saw anything unusual. Wes has no interest in his family and wouldn't tell anybody about them or even go down their street. If Wes happened to ride his bike, which is all those kids did back then, with his friends past the house, Wes was to not even look in their direction. And so Wes just shook his head yes. But Wes was convinced that he'll remember all of this and they'll be sorry. But Wes will play it safe and tell them exactly what they want to hear. So he tensed a little, sighed, and shook his head. Now this man, whoever this guy was, he was the father of these cat-eyed children, had told Wes in his ear that Wes wouldn't do anything because he would have to come back and take out his family. And instantly, Wes knew that this man could hear his thoughts. And that terrified Wes because he knew that they would come back and do as they said. I know this story and this ever-continuing stream of bizarre memories is slightly confusing, but from what it sounds is that Wes and his sister had these traumatizing experiences with what they believed to be draconians or reptilian people. Butch grew up living in a small town in Texas. Butch is 18 years old and finishing up their senior year of high school. He had gotten back home from a track meet at about 9 p.m. at night, and it just turned dark outside. Getting out of the truck, he noticed some eye shine in the woods right outside the fence about 10 meters away. Now, given where Butch lives, he thought it was just another stupid deer, most likely the one who had ate his parents' mint plants. So he grabs his bag from the back seat, flips it off, and went inside. 15 minutes later, he was on the back porch drawing hot water for a soaking bath to hopefully relieve the pain in his legs, because they have a giant bathtub on the back porch that they affectionately call the spa. Earlier that day, Butch had helped his relay team get first and advance to area, as well as set himself a new personal best in his individual running event. Anyway, once the scalding hot water was drawn, Butch had put on one of a What Lurks Beneath video. Now, ironically, and just as he had listened and was lying there in the water, about the end of the video, roughly 35 minutes later, he hears a rustling in the leaves right behind the fence, believing it to be an armadillo, but then he hears this low growl and a slight snarl. This immediately kicked in his oh heck no instincts, going into full overdrive, so he turns the video off completely, grabs his flashlight and listens. And he hears the fence rattle a little bit and a heavy thump, followed by a slow crunching. His nose is suddenly assaulted by the smell of a rancid, stinking dog, and he could hear the slow, methodical breathing of a large, likely dangerous animal. Then, the porch shuddered as he had seen a slight discoloration in the paint of the banister on a small area. Butch hesitantly put the flashlight on the area and clicks the button. What he saw will never be forgotten. In the blinding light of the flashlight, he saw what appeared to be a huge wolf head, followed by a hairy but very distinctly humanoid upper torso. It had enough muscle mass to make any bodybuilder blush in shame. You must understand that the porch itself is only 4 feet off the ground, so for this thing to see Butch, the thing must have been at least 8 feet tall. Its angry yellow eyes dilated when he had blinded it with his flashlight, and it snarled while using its arms to shield its eyes. It appeared to shift posture, like how someone telegraphs their movements in a boxing match, except instead of throwing a powerful right hook, it vertically jumped up and landed on the porch, and Butch could hear the wood creak in protest. It began to stalk the short distance toward him, flexing its claws and letting loose another growl. Looking back, Butch admits that he was so incomprehensibly dumb and claims that he didn't even really feel fear, but at this moment, with what looked like a werewolf that had been locked in the gym for an entire year slowly approaching him, he freezes up, did not shrink away or cower because he physically couldn't. All his muscles tensed up at once, making him unable to move. As this thing got within about 7 feet of Butch, it stopped, staring down at him while he just stood there, knee-deep in hot water, literally staring back up at it. And it was right then that one of Butch's dogs woke itself up barking, making his other 2 dogs start barking as well. And Butch believes this honestly saved his life, as he thinks this monster was just expecting an easy kill or something. It had snarled one last time, slashed at him with its claws, and ran off into the forest. It looked back one more time, and that was when Butch had realized it was the exact same eye shine as when he had got out of the truck, and he had flipped it off and turned his back on it. It is a miracle he is still alive, honestly. It managed to nick him when it slashed, leaving a shallow cut on his chest. Butch is aware you might not believe him, but he has the scar and the memories to prove this. So what do you guys think? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I would love to hear your opinions. Also, don't forget to smack that like button. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and hit that big ol' red subscribe button and keep your notifications turned on, so that way YouTube will let you know every time I release a great new video. As always, guys, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I will see you guys in the very next video.